Nobody on Caldwell Road could quite explain what Marin Hollis was doing. She was 9 years old. She carried seedlings in a bucket. She knelt in the mud beside the old drainage ditch at the edge of her family's property in Warren County, Iowa, and she planted grass. Not pasture grass, not lawn seed scattered from a bag. Tall, deliberate native grass, switchgrass, big bluestem, planted in careful clusters, pressed firmly into the soft bank soil with her small, bare hands. She wasn't decorating anything. She wasn't following a school project. No teacher had assigned it. No parent had requested it. Her older brothers hadn't touched that ditch in years. Her father, Dale Hollis, tended the corn and the soybean fields further back from the road and never once suggested anyone plant anything along that low, wet strip of land. Yet every Saturday morning, rain or shine, Marin came back to that ditch. She brought more seedlings, she brought a notebook, she wrote things down, measurements, dates, which patches were taking hold and which ones weren't. Their neighbors, the Brannigan family 2 properties over, would slow down driving past. Eleanor Brannigan told her husband she thought the girl was trying to pretty up the ditch, give the old drainage line some character. He glanced over, nodded, and kept driving. It seemed harmless enough, a child planting tall grass along a muddy ditch for the look of it. Maybe she'd seen something like it in a magazine. Nobody thought it was wrong, nobody thought it was important. They just thought it was something a child did to make an ugly ditch look nicer. They were wrong. If you love true stories about ordinary people solving extraordinary problems on working farmland, subscribe. We'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. The Hollis family had farmed the same 280 acres in Warren County since Dale's grandfather broke ground there in 1938. Corn and soybeans in the main fields, a small herd of black Angus cattle on the north pasture, a kitchen garden behind the house that Dale's wife Suzanne kept going through April frosts with sheer determination. Warren County sits in the south-central part of Iowa. The land rolls gently in most places, but along the lower edges of the Hollis property, the terrain flattens out toward a natural drainage corridor, a long, winding ditch that carried runoff from the fields down toward a creek half a mile east. Iowa receives an average of 35 inches of rain per year. Most of it falls heavy and fast in spring and early summer. For farmers, the drainage ditch is both a blessing and a problem. Marin had been watching that ditch since she was 6 years old, not playing near it, watching it. After every hard rain, she crouched at the bank and studied the water. She noticed the way it ran fast in the channel. She noticed the color, brown, silted, heavy, and how the muddy water carried something with it when it left. She noticed how the banks had grown lower and wider over the years, how the edges crumbled a little more each season. Her father called it normal. Ditches move, he told her once, always have. Marin wrote that down, too. The spring Marin turned 8. A wet April sent 2 inches of rain in 40 minutes across the county. The Hollis field survived, but the ditch did not. A 20-foot section of the west bank collapsed. The runoff cut a new channel sideways through the corner of the lower soybean field. By morning, Dale estimated he had lost nearly 4 inches of topsoil across half an acre. The dark, rich soil, the product of decades of careful farming, had washed east with the water. Dale repaired what he could. He hired a neighbor with a small excavator to reshape the bank. He graded the soil. He moved on. Marin stood at the edge of the repaired ditch and stared at the exposed subsoil, the pale, compacted earth where the dark topsoil had been. She pressed her foot against it, hard, dry, wrong. She understood, even at 8 years old, that the problem had not been fixed. The bank had been reshaped, but nothing was holding it. That autumn, Marin began asking questions. She started with her grandfather, Everett Hollis, who was 73 and had watched more springs flood through that county than anyone cared to count. Everett had a stack of old farm bulletins from the USDA in a cardboard box in his garage, publications from the 1970s and 1980s. Marin sat on a folding chair and read them with a flashlight. She found language she didn't fully understand at first: vegetative filter strips, riparian buffers, infiltration rates, sediment trapping efficiency. She wrote the words down and looked them up. Then, in March of the following year, the March she turned 9, her mother drove her to the Warren County office of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the NRCS, where a soft-spoken field agent named Gerald Combs spent 45 minutes talking with a 9-year-old girl who arrived with a notebook full of questions. Gerald Combs had spent 30 years working with farmers on exactly this problem. He explained it plainly. When water runs fast through a bare ditch, it carries soil with it. The faster the water moves, the more it takes. Every rainstorm that moves unchecked through an open channel strips the bank a little further. Over time, the ditch widens, the bank collapses, and the topsoil, the most productive layer of the farm, migrates downstream and is gone. But roots change everything. Deep-rooted native grasses, switchgrass in particular, send root systems 4, 5, sometimes 6 feet into the soil. Those roots hold the bank together like fingers gripping sand. They slow incoming water. They spread it. They force it to drop the sediment it's carrying before it can cut further into the channel. The grass above the soil acts as a filter. The roots below act as an anchor. It doesn't stop the flood, Gerald told her. It slows it down, and slowing water down is everything. Marin wrote every word. Before she left, Gerald mentioned that the NRCs ran a native plant program, reduced-cost grass plugs for exactly this kind of conservation work. He said he would set some aside for her. She began planting that April, switchgrass, big bluestem, eastern gamagrass along the wetter sections. The plugs came from the NRC's program Gerald had described. She paid for part of them with money she had saved from helping her grandmother at the farm stand the previous summer. The work was harder than she expected. The bank soil was dense and waterlogged in places. Her hands blistered within the first hour. She planted before school on weekday mornings and spent full Saturdays kneeling along the bank, pressing seedlings in by hand, tamping the soil down around each one with a stick. Her brothers offered to help once. She accepted. They lasted 40 minutes. Neighbors continued to drive past. Eleanor Brannigan would glance over and smile, still certain the girl was just trying to make the ditch look presentable. A few others said the same to Dale when they ran into him in town. "That daughter of yours sure loves to pretty things up." Dale would nod and say she was doing a project. He didn't interfere. He had noticed the notebook. Not everything held. A dry stretch in July baked the upper bank, and a third of the switchgrass seedlings went thin and yellow. Marin lost a section near the cattle crossing when the Angus cows found the new planting and walked through it 3 mornings in a row, compacting the soil and breaking the young stems. Dale helped her string a single strand of wire fence along that section. It wasn't elaborate. It was enough. She replanted the failed patches in late August. She chose a more drought-tolerant cultivar for the upper bank. She adjusted her spacing. She did not complain. She wrote down what failed and why. Winter came and stripped the grasses back to brown, brittle stems, but below the surface the roots kept growing. Spring returned and brought with it the first real sign. Along the planted sections, fresh green growth emerged thick and fast, 3 feet tall by June, dense and upright, the stems overlapping into a continuous wall of vegetation along the bank. Where the soil had once been bare and vulnerable, it was now threaded through at every depth with root mass. By the second summer, the ditch had already begun to change. The bank held its shape. The channel narrowed slightly where the vegetation had begun to slow the normal flow. Even in moderate rains, the water that ran through the Hollis ditch emerged at the east end, noticeably clearer than it had in years, less brown, less heavy. Gerald Combs drove out that August to have a look. He stood at the bank for a long time without saying anything. Then he asked Marin if she would be willing to speak at a county conservation meeting that coming October. She said she would. She did. She stood at the front of a meeting room in Indianola with her notebook and answered every question put to her. Gerald introduced her as the youngest conservation farmer he had ever worked with. She corrected him. She said she was just someone who had watched the water long enough. The following May, Marin's third spring of planting, the roots now running deep and established across the full length of the ditch, brought a weather system nobody in the county had seen in 30 years. 10 days of slow, saturating rain across central Iowa, followed by a 48-hour storm that dropped nearly 7 inches across Warren County. The ground was already saturated. The creeks were already high. The National Weather Service issued a flash flood watch, then upgraded it to a warning. Dale Hollis walked his fields and said very little. He moved the cattle to the high pasture. He checked the corn. He checked the ditch. The water came fast and dark. Across the county, bare ditch banks collapsed under the pressure. Culverts backed up. Fields flooded from the edges inward. The Brannigan property lost a fence line and a section of pasture when their drainage ditch cut sideways. Another neighbor 2 miles north watched the runoff carry loose soil across his lower field in visible brown sheets. On the Hollis property, the water rose to the lip of the ditch. Then it slowed. The switchgrass absorbed the force. The water spread laterally across the bank vegetation rather than cutting downward. The roots, 3 years deep into the subsoil, dense and interlocked, held. The sediment that would have moved downstream dropped instead into the filter strip, caught by the base of the grasses before it could leave the property. The bank did not collapse. The field behind it did not flood. When the rain finally stopped and the water receded, Dale Hollis walked the full length of his ditch without losing his footing once. The channel was intact. The banks were intact. The topsoil was intact. He stood at the far end for a long time. Then he walked back to the house. He found Marin at the kitchen table with her notebook open, already recording water levels. He sat down across from her. "I should have asked sooner what you were doing out there," he said. She looked up. "Now you know," she said. That was enough for both of them. The Brannigans came over 4 days after the flood, not to complain, to ask. Eleanor Brannigan stood at the edge of the ditch and looked at the grass, still standing, still green, still holding, and said quietly that she had assumed all along it was just for decoration. Marin walked them the full length of the bank and explained what she had done and why. She explained root depth. She explained how water velocity increases in a bare channel, and how vegetation reduces that velocity by creating friction, forcing the water to slow, to spread, to release what it's carrying before it can cut further into the soil. She explained that stopping a flood was impossible, but changing how water moves through a landscape was not. Healthy soil absorbs more than bare soil, she told them. Roots hold what rain tries to take. She was 12 years old. By the following spring, 3 neighboring properties had installed vegetative filter strips along their own drainage ditches. Gerald Combs from the NRCS referenced the Hollis ditch in 2 county conservation workshops. The Warren County Extension Office began distributing native grass plug kits with a simple instruction sheet. Marin Hollis did not give speeches. She answered questions when asked, and then she helped 2 neighboring families select the right grass varieties for their specific bank conditions. She kept her notebook. The greatest harvest from those 280 acres that year wasn't corn. It wasn't soybeans. It was the soil still sitting exactly where it had always been. Dark, deep, and present, because a quiet child had watched the water long enough to understand what it was taking, and then decided to do something about it. Wendell Berry once wrote, "The soil is the great connector of lives, the source and destination of all." Marin Hollis understood that before most adults on Caldwell Road ever thought to ask the question, "What's the farming lesson that has stayed with you longest? And where in the world are you watching from?" Tell us in the comments. We read everyone.